Welcome to the March 2022 CIECAST, Using Technology to Communicate Effectively with Customers. I'm Paul Berry, Executive Director of CIECA. The Collision Industry Electronic Commerce Association, or CIECA, develops and promotes electronic communication standards that allow the collision industry to be more efficient. We also provide webinars like this one to help educate both members and non-members on trends that impact systems, processes, and the exchange of data across the industry. Today's presenters are Dean Fisher, President of Collision for Driven Brands, and Jim Keller, President and COO of One Collision. Dean Fisher has over 40 years of experience in the automotive industry. In his current role as President of Collision and with Driven Brands, which includes companies such as CARSTAR, Abra, and Mako, he's focused on helping franchisees maximize growth, profitability, and operational excellence. Jim Keller is the President and COO of the One Collision Network. He too has more than 40 years in the industry. Jim is an MSO owner, a partner and an early consolidator, and an active member in the industry in organizations such as ICAR, ASA, and CIC. Well, thank you, gentlemen. We appreciate both of you taking time from your busy schedules to join us. Hopefully we'll have an informative discussion here today. Before we get started, I want to remind the audience that there is no verbal communication between the participants and the presenter. If you have questions during the webinar, please type them in the question panel on the webinar screen. We'll answer as many questions as possible at the end of the presentation. And with that, let's get started. So Dean, I'd like to start with you. Lots of technology changes have been going on in the industry in recent years. From your view, what are the critical issues the industry is facing today and likely to face over the next few years?
Yeah, great question, Paul. I think the first thing that we need to just talk about as the elephant in the room is the pace of change, right? So we're going to have an accelerated pace of change relative to the technology that's in the vehicle, the technology that we're going to be working with, the educational platforms that we need to work with. The OEMs are changing dramatically in the way they're addressing the vehicle. And so I think the pace of change in the industry is going to be a critical factor related to that. I think we're going to have to watch out for securitization, right? And the security related to the automobile and frankly, also the customer information. I don't know that our stores are real mature in the security protocols around that as we go more paperless to some degree and as more technology comes on board and we digitize more of our information relative to what we're doing. And when I talk about security, that's kind of interesting because that can actually even roll into scanning procedures and calibration procedures and making sure that we're protecting that data as it's entering the car and what that looks like relative to the shop. And then, of course, we're going to have to work through some of the EV protocols relative to the change and scope of how we are repairing the vehicle. And I know we'll be talking about that probably in this conversation because that's a big topic today relative to where we're at. And then the last thing, there's kind of 4 points I'm making here, is the OE repair and our linkage that we create with them. I think it's going to be a critical issue for us in the next few years as the complexity of the automobile and the repairability of it depends more on OE protocols and OE outcomes. And we're going to have to merge the repair modeling within our facilities to the OE repair standards and outcomes that they're going to be critical to the ability for the car to function correctly and calibrate itself relative to the safety protocols that are built into the vehicle.
Great. Thanks, Dean. Yeah, a lot of issues on the table, that's for sure. From your perspective, what kind of changes are your shops dealing with, and what are the impacts of those changes to the shop?
Some of the challenges to the shop is even space constraints and or recalibration of their shop space and how they're going to utilize that. At some point in time, think about this. Related to EV cars, we're going to be storing batteries, on major repairs, and so we're going to be taking out batteries and putting battery. And when I say a battery, I'm talking about removing a floor in a vehicle in some cases relative how that's built, and what that's going to look like. So I think in the future, that's going to be a critical piece of how we're setting up the shop and how we're processing in the shop and relative to that. I heard Jim kind of mention, and really it's the word diagnostics, right? But more and more, it's really interesting because I think some of the challenges relative to technology in the shop are really almost having a diagnostic specialist within the shop that's actually part of your production team or your production manager that's actually helping look and interface with the technicians relative to that, and then making that information to them. I see in the future where our techs will be using pads or their phone structure and apps, to look up and interface and get knowledge very quickly. I see companies, that'll come forward and process that. I see groups like yourself, CIECA, ICAR, and others that are going to have to help with those formats and what we're going to need relative to speed of repair, right, within the shop and how we're going to work through that. So I think that there's a lot that'll be going on relative to how we'll be using technology in the shop, and that we'll see a technician and or specialist within that shop that'll be very interfaced with technology in a digitized world relative to the repair process.
So, Dean, I'm going to tag on to that then. It's no surprise that consumers are asking for more and more features in their cars, and the technology is enabling it. But that comes at a cost. I mean, there's certainly an impact to that. How is consumer demand for more features advancing technology within the collision industry?
Yeah, interesting. I think the first thing is really communicating carefully with the customer related to their vehicle, because they like what it's doing relative to smart cruise, and lane change and keeping them and in the lane and stopping for them and all the things that are going on and all the lights that go off when you're changing lanes and there's a car next to you. But at the same time, we're working with that. I think there's an important part of discussing that with the customer today and helping them understand what your interface as a repairer is going to be with the vehicle and what they can expect related to that. Interesting enough, during the repair process, I think some of this is really interesting related to how we communicate with them and what is happening around that process there. When I look at this question, I kind of look at, how is the consumer demand advancing technology? Well, I think the consumer is demanding more of a touchless experiences, if you will. We're getting to a process where they can literally accomplish everything relative to a claims management process and literally just drop off their car, or you could go get it for them, and bring it back to the shop. And so I think that's I saw a really good article about this, by the way, just a few weeks ago, relative to what is the consumer thinking about that digital experience and how are they rating it? And by the way, consumer rating falls on the repair process when they're using that right now. But I think that's some of their confusion related to when they submit photos, and we have them do the photos and they upload that. And then we look at a vehicle for them, and really a triage experience that needs to happen versus we just look at that and just go, okay, and you're creating actually, this is interesting because I always call it a repair plan, right? But we still say estimates, so, and the consumer thinks like that. They think estimate. But I think at some point in time, as an industry, we've got to change that language and that understanding to a consumer relative to them understanding you're creating a repair plan. When I was in my shops, I used to say the last time I want to hear estimate is when the customer says it to us and says, I need an estimate. And that's the last time I want to hear that word in our shop. Well, that was kind of interesting because you're trying to change the consumer to thinking about, oh, yeah, you're creating a repair plan, you're processing my claim, you're managing that for me. Well, in a digital world, they're still thinking estimate. And so what happens is, they get an app, they're using that, they're filing a claim there, and then suddenly someone's saying, well, take photos and we can give you a remote estimate, which is really interesting, a remote estimate. Well, what happens is they're unhappy, and it's interesting, both ways they're unhappy. And this is real important for us because there's probably insurers on here. Well, they're unhappy with the insurer because they think somebody underestimated their vehicle, you see what I'm saying? but they don't understand that the vehicle complexity adds a process in which we have to take the vehicle apart. We call it DFR, disassembly for repair. So we have to take the car apart to look at it to make sure that it doesn't have any additional damage. So either they think the repair is taking advantage of them, or they think the insurer is taking advantage of them. So we're caught in this crossfire right now, which makes it really interesting. So communication is a huge key related to that moment, right? And how we interface with them immediately. And we don't have that mastered yet. We don't have that down right, where we're interfacing through the app with them on the triage, almost saying to them, your car doesn't qualify for remote repair planning. You see what I'm saying? And trying to work through that when we first see the pictures and working through that. I think the other part of consumer demand, as they get it and they sense it, and we can talk a little bit about an OnStar type technology, but when the OE and or a call center starts interacting with them in the car, I think that's going to create a lot of new modeling for us relative to setting the stage for the consumer to have a good event. Right now, what we focus on is speed of claim, right? We think speed of claim is going to manage that, but speed of claim can be our tripping point if we don't manage the communication, and it's on all sets, right? It's the insurer or first notice of loss, could be the OE and their interaction with them, and when the customer first interfaces with the repair center and they train their people up front that are managing that process to communicate properly with the customer to help set the expectations for the experience that's going to happen. It's a lot of work. I think we can use technology to do that. And I think I just gave an example where someone says, hey, I'd like to do photo, I'd like to do this all remote. And the first thing they do is plug that thing in because they say their car's a driver, and you see a TP hood on that thing and the front end's hanging off of it, but they can still drive it, right? And I think at that point in time, we have to help them understand doesn't qualify. We need to look at the car and set a better repair plan for that, or set the expectation of the customer that we can get you a general overview of the damage, but it will have to have final assessment at the repair center at that point in time. I think that's where we're getting with this kind of technology.
Great. Thanks, Dean. I think you made a really good point. I think it's, the term estimate shoots the whole industry in the foot. It's, as recently as yesterday, my daughter called me up because she had her car in the shop and the estimate was a lot less than the repair. And, we went through the same conversation. So I think you're right on point with that. What are the shops doing to facilitate customer communication? And where do you see it going in the future?
Relative to the communication, and what needs to happen there. I think, related to this conversation, and utilizing technology, I think we have to understand that when we start to use technology, that we can't let it burn us. And it's really interesting to me because I think there's a younger set that likes a chat box. That's really interesting to me. And at some point in time, I think that you could end up with a chat box type protocol for our stores relative to allowing the customer to interface with the store through a chat box and or a call center that's been highly trained to manage that chat box for you relative to some of the questions that you might get there. But at the same time, I talk about that, and I think some of us on this call might understand how hard that is to manage a call center and the call center protocols and the level of expertise that you can manage there, and then what happens from that. But at the same time, if they're interfacing with the store, I think there's that opportunity to create that. There's another group of us, and I'm raising my hand. I still like a live person. I like to talk to a live person, but I'm the age that likes that, wants a live person and somebody to pick up the phone, and I don't want to sit there and have to type to somebody and see if it's all going to work while I type to it. And sometimes it's a robot, right, that I'm typing to. I think that we have to be careful with that and understanding that. That's why I love that article a few weeks ago. As we digitize ourselves and go to that level, I think that we have to monitor that very carefully relative to consumer satisfaction and make sure that that's happening. I think the other thing is there's a critical piece to this when we start to engage a customer right up front, asking them and determining what's their preferred process, a phone call, an email, a text, what's their preferred messaging protocol. We do that in our shops now, and then we check the box, right? And then we make sure that we lock and load that protocol relative to that. Or we explain to them, if we're using, and we do, where we're using a tech system that notifies them during the repair process of even where the vehicle is in that repair process and what's happening. I think it's important to help the customer understand that process and move into that protocol. More and more, I think that we can expect some automation relative to the OEs and how they continue to adapt to the consumer preferences relative to the vehicle. I think we will see more OEs interface with the customer at the point of repair or at their point of the accident, and to some degree control that process. I realize there will have to always be an interface with an insurer who's managing the claims and the first notice of loss, unless they're self-insured through the OE. But I think that we'll have to make sure that we manage that protocol and develop clean handoffs with technology managing that. We love automation. It's interesting. Some stores really struggle with it, but once they do it and get it, they really like automation. They like, having their scheduler self-populated for them. It's 7 or 8 minutes that somebody didn't have to spend time on the phone. And so if you can self-populate that and then they can manage the customer expectations, that really works very well for them.
Great, thanks. So Dean, we talked a minute ago about repair plans, and the reality is that vehicle repair is very different today, and it can vary from vehicle to vehicle and from model to model. For that to work well, the shops have to be able to access the correct repair procedures. We hear from a lot of shops that getting access to that information at the appropriate time can be challenging. What do your shops see, and what thoughts do you have on this area?
Yeah, this is a little controversial for me. And actually, I'm the guy who got the controversial question on this last time when we were live. I think I got some kind of question like this, Paul. So I love that you're being controversial and driving us back into this question again.
Happy to
help. Jim, where are you? Right?
So. I am back. I called in.
Oh, great.
Okay, that's great. So let me work on this a minute, Jim, and then you help me out a little bit. Okay. So the bottom line is this: is that I don't know why an OE manufacturer wouldn't want us to have the repair data information. And I understand that they've gone and they've spent millions of dollars engineering a vehicle and patent rights to certain things and all of that. And I appreciate that and respect that, by the way, highly respect that. But at the same time, every shop in the world isn't going to be certified. I'll say it like that. And you're still going to have vehicles that will be repaired by an uncertified shop to some degree. And that's an interesting connotation for me relative to that. And that's a whole nother conversation, another controversy that we could talk about. But my point is that OE repair plan and repair procedures should always be made available to a shop. And I believe that the OEs, whenever I talk to them, they're always saying, we want our cars repaired safely and appropriately. We know that if that car is repaired correctly and properly, the customer's happy with that model of vehicle that they're in and has less of an opportunity to switch models and to move on to another OE manufacturer. So I know that they want to control that and manage that, but I think it's very important that we get that information. Right now, that information sometimes is made available free through a certification process. Sometimes it's still made available, but there's a cost to getting that information. And I think we need to be careful with that and make sure that we understand that we want all of anyone repairing a vehicle to have access to that repair plan modeling that the OE has created. I think more and more we're going to see that the repair industry is going to respect that very highly and respect that repair modeling relative to how they're fixing a car. I know that iCar works closely with the OEs relative to helping with the training platforms and the training protocols on that. It's going to be more and more important to us that we make sure that those that are touching that car and repairing that car are educated at the highest level and that the information is available to them so that they can repair the car correctly.
Jim, did you want to weigh in on that?
I would totally agree with that. I think things have gotten better in that regard, but I think there's still a long way to go, for sure.
Okay.
And without the procedures, the safe and proper repair will never happen. You know, you can't have that without the procedures. So I know that, you know, if you're in the OE certified programs, and some of the manufacturers, you know, differ in how they approach this, but if you're in the OE, you know, programs, you're going to get the procedures a lot easier than if you're not. And so it's really becoming an industry of haves and have-nots.
Great.
You know, that's interesting. I saw an example because a shop may take and get a repair procedure, get the same vehicle in a year later, and then just go to their archives and pull the repair procedure. I saw an exceptional example by one of the OE manufacturers that I was working with of, you know, their ongoing resolution to the repairability and how a car crashes, right? And literally, they were doing testing with that vehicle model year and crashing that vehicle, right? And then repairing it, and then determined that they did not like the sectioning piece that they had given originally. And then 9 months later, changed the sectioning protocol for that panel, right? And so I think that it's important that we also recognize you always have to go back to the repair procedures. And that's why I say they need to be really readily available to us through technology, through pads that we can access and that our repair people can look at and that we can hold them accountable to during the repair process, so that we make sure that that proper procedure was done and that we had the information that was timely and dated to that vehicle.
Thank you both. Jim, when you and I spoke a few weeks ago, we talked about standardization, the fact that CIECA is an industry association that develops standards. But standardization goes far beyond just data standards. And what are your thoughts on this? As an industry, are we standardized, or is there still room for improvement in process, procedure, and operations?
Yeah, that's a really excellent question, Paul. It's something that has been discussed for many decades in our industry, not as much in the past, and it's way more relevant today than it's ever been. And you know, here's my take on this. We have several hundred insurers in the U.S. that insure cars. We have tens of thousands of body shops that repair them, and it's somebody's responsibility to get everybody on the same page, which is, you know, the only value in standards is if everybody buys into them and is on that same page, right? So how do you make that happen? And many have tried, and I think we've come a long way. I think even in the last year or two, there's been some movement towards everybody talking with each other. I think it was always the body shop and the insurance company always trying to figure it out. The last 5 years or so, we've seen a huge increase in the amount of involvement that the OEs have. I think that's probably one of the best things that's happened to our industry, to be honest with you, that if we ever are going to truly have standards, we have to have the criteria within those standards to follow. And most of the time, it's, should we do this procedure or not? And the OEs are our salvation there. So I really think that we're on the right track. And, you know, in our business, we meet with insurers regularly and we meet with OEs, as I know, Dean, you do as well. And what we hear from the insurers many times is that they have meetings with the OEs and they're trying to figure some things out. And the OEs talk to us and let us know that they meet with insurers and they try to figure out ways on, you know, getting closer together and working and collaborating. So I think we're on the way to get there, but there's a long way to go. There's so much difference between one shop to another, one insurer to another, one OE to another. Some are very comprehensive in their procedures, and some, you know, on the OE side, they're not as comprehensive. So it's, you know, there's a lot to manage there, and there's a lot to get our arms around. And the question is, how does it get done? Is that going to be a combination of CIECA and CIC and ASA and SCRS and AASP and ICAR and the manufacturers, the insurance companies, the shops? I'm chairman of the CIC Industry Relations Committee with co-chair rather with Jonathan Chase and from CSAA Insurance, and I'll tell you, some of the discussions we have is it's a very large challenge to try and get your arms around everything that happens in our industry. And when you look at how many stakeholders there are that would be involved in the standardization process, how do we get that done other than a little bit here and a little bit there? I wish I had the answer, because I think that would bring a lot of value to this discussion. But I think there's groups out there and there's organizations, and I think everybody would like it because it would make everything a lot easier to operate within, regardless of what sector of the industry you're a part of.
Great. Thank you very much. Yeah, I agree with you. There's a lot of opportunity with a lot of players and a lot of different stakeholders. So, Dean, I'm going to bring it back to you then. So we touched on this to a point earlier, but all this new technology comes at a price for the shop. So what does this new technology, what cost does it create? And what can we do to contain the costs of the technological innovations as an industry?
Yeah, here's a loaded question, right, Paul? So, I think as we look at it, we need to understand, it's interesting, in a raw moment here, I'll just say, I've had people say to me 20 years ago, that's a cost of doing business. And my comment always back to them was, you're correct, and we'll have to pay for that, So I think that we need to understand that there is a cost of doing business into all this technology and the things that we want to happen. And sometimes I believe that it is literally the cost of this that actually delays the technology and the movement that we want and the speed of change relative to the cost that comes to the end user, right? And so I think that as we help them to understand and how they can integrate that into a store and into their repair plan procedures and what that will look like, and they know that they can buy that MRI machine and get paid to use it, I think that's important. But saying that, I understand on the other side, and you can see it right now, we're caught in a huge crossfire relative to inflation and lack of human resources, right? So here we are with, inflation running 7 to 10 points, insurers, they didn't set an actuary for that. They've been going around for two decades at 1 to 2%, right? And so here insurers are going to be reeling from that process. They're going to be trying to go to state controllers relative to, how they mandate that. Also knowing that, if we raise our rates, we're going to have a war over here with the consumer relative to those rates and the insurability of a consumer on an automobile. So I get it. I get that we're in a crossfire and the end user does have a cause and effect to that. But at the same time, it's going to take a lot of work in this industry to recognize and understand that the vehicle is going to get more complicated. It is going to be more expensive to repair. And when I say more expensive to repair, we're talking, we moved $500 on an ARO in probably 10 or 15 years. We're about to move double. We're about to go $2,000 relative to that in 3 to 5 years. So when we understand that the market's going to substantially change, and we're already seeing that, then we need to recognize that the cost of doing business is going to be substantial in nature and relative to that process, which, by the way, sometimes isn't healthy for us because it will relate in greater total losses, less repairable vehicles, all the things that happen there. And so however we can utilize technology and the digital forces relative to, helping a consumer have a good experience, repairing the vehicle with a quality and safe process and speed of repair in that model and what that looks like, and then recognize the training and the educational platforms that will need to be associated with that and what we need to do about that, the better off we're going to be. And I love where Jim was headed there. And then working through the political factions, right, of the industry relative to CIECA and ICAR and everybody else that wants a piece of the pie, right, and what that's going to look like. But the sooner we model that and work through that, the better off we're going to be. Think about the power of a repair plan process, that you're working through your repair plan software and you have OE procedures that are connected, or at least an aspect or something that indicates this will demand an OE repair plan and what that looks like now. We monitor that through central review right now. If you're doing a structural repair on a vehicle, we demand not only photos of the vehicle when it was uploaded, but we demand photos of that structural repair that's being made on the vehicle so that we can monitor that, right? But everybody doesn't have that capability, right? And they're going to have to build in that capability and what that's going to look like for themselves relative to that. But the bottom line is, it's going to be more expensive to repair a vehicle. It's going to be more expensive relative to managing your shop floor and what that's going to look like relative to equipment and space modeling that you're going to have to build in to repair a vehicle.
Yeah, as we sit here today in March of 2022, it's a bit of a perfect storm with all this development in vehicle technology, and then layer on COVID, all the inflation that's come out in the last couple of years related to that, and throw in a war in Ukraine. There are a lot of variables right now. I'm sure these things will come to pass, but there are a lot of unknowns at the moment. That's for sure.
Think about one of our most critical KPIs that we've had for a decade has been repair versus replace, right? And so here we are in a repair versus replace, which, by the way, we almost need to repair everything we possibly can right now because we can't get the part all the time, right? We're having parts issues, right, relative to that. But we're treading a fine line with our stores, and that's why we're using our central review and guidance, and we're even training people around this, is that, well, you have to be careful about what you're going to repair and what you put 8 hours of repair on a high-strength steel panel and what that looks like after it takes its next crash, you see? So you've got to start thinking through that relative to, do I repair or do I replace? And so it's an interesting measurement to me. And sometimes when I'm talking with our insurance team and internally and our operations group and everything, and I'm meeting with them and they're briefing me on things that they're doing and coach, counsel, and consult, we call it our 3 C's, and how they're interacting with our stores. That's a huge caution and a huge issue for us relative to, do you repair or do you replace? Because in some cases, the manufacturer, the way they manufacture the car, it's demanding a replacement versus a repair modeling on the vehicle to retain the safety protocols of the vehicle.
Great, thanks. So transitioning right then, Jim, into the next question, which is EVs. EVs are not brand new, certainly, and we've been repairing them for a few years. But they were very small numbers. And when you do something in small numbers, you can have, special procedures and you can live with it. But EV sales are starting to climb, and manufacturers are starting to roll out a lot more models. The reality is we're going to see a lot more EVs coming into shops in the next couple of years. What challenges do you anticipate we're going to have to deal with as these EVs scale up?
Sure. So, some of the things that we're seeing that shops that are starting to repair them and through their OE partners are looking at repairing more of them in the future. Some of the things that are going to be necessary is, of course, training, because you touch the wrong thing at the wrong time and somebody could get killed. I mean, that's how serious the product itself is. So training is going to be, imperative there. The equipment for moving and handling the batteries, if they're removed, is a purchase that's going to be required. And again, training and that type of thing. Many manufacturers of the current models, as well as models that'll come out, are talking about having to actually build a concrete block structure within your shop, which takes up square footage, which these days is really valuable to most shops, or it's going to have to be outside the shop, but it's going to have to be a concrete block building to store the batteries. If you're doing multiple repairs, there's going to have to be multiple batteries stored, and there's going to be a whole process for how you move them and store them. So again, it's another process, it's another procedure, and it's another thing that, you know, we're going to have to invest time, money, training to put into our shops. And, you know, then of course, you know, just how to deal with, you know, all the other various factors that come along with it. So I think there's a capital investment there, and but, you know, at the end of the day, I guess shops that are doing a car that's got, you know, electrical power don't have to worry about the fuel situation or making sure they have a full tank when they do calibrations. You know, so that'll take out some things we don't have to deal with on gas vehicles, but it just creates some other things we have to do with processes, procedures, and storage of those batteries when they're removed.
So, Jim, tying on to what you just mentioned, you know, with the EV batteries, obviously there's a charge life, you know, a lifespan of these batteries, and then there's also its current state. Tracking all of that information is kind of new. You know, it didn't really matter in the past if the gas tank was half full or 3/4 full, but when you're dealing with these batteries, the charge state of the battery can make a difference. How does that impact shops when they're having to deal with and handle these batteries?
Yeah, that's a great point. And actually, I did have that in my notes. I just kind of missed over it. But we actually have a shop right now in our network that's building a brand new 40,000 square foot facility as a second shop. And they're adding charging stations both inside and outside of the facility, where they're going to be able to accommodate the you know, charging capabilities for cars that they have in process, or you know, waiting to get into for repairs, or even post repair, so that the customer can have a, you know, fully charged vehicle when they come to pick it up. These are all things that are new, and we don't maybe even know what some of those connections might be in the future. I'm not sure exactly what standards we have for, I know some vehicles have different type of charging systems. So, you know, shops of the future are going to have to also invest in charging stations for these cars if they're going to fix them.
I've heard some discuss that perhaps some shops will specialize in EV and others will continue to focus on the ICE engines. Any thoughts on that? Do you see that as a likely outcome, or do you think shops are going to just have to learn to deal with both?
I don't know. I think if you're gonna serve the motoring public, we know they can't serve everyone with every make and model, just because of some of the restrictions on structural parts and things like that we have in place currently. But you know, if Mrs. Jones was driving a gas-powered you know, vehicle this year, and 3 years from now she loved what she did, she loved the customer service, the car was repaired properly, everything worked, and she comes back to you, you're going to be disappointed in your business if you can't repair her electrical. You know what I'm saying? And Dean, you know, you've been in the industry, I think, as many years as I have. You know, repeat business is a big part of a really good shop book of business. You have your DRP referrals, your OE referrals, your referrals from other sources. But repeat business is what our industry was really built on, starting in the old days when, you know, we were repairing old steel vehicles with frame cars. It's the repeat customer and that sense of security they get coming back to your store that, you know, is a big part of what we do. And so I think that's one of the things that, you know, I think are probably going to go away, because to your point, Paul, some shops will choose not to go down the EV path. And each time you draw a barrier in what you can or can't do as a repairer, you are limiting yourself to some of the volume that's going to be out there. So I think it's an interesting quagmire, call it if you will, that it's probably inevitable that all shops can't repair all vehicles in the future.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Yeah, it's very much an interesting time, no doubt about it. Dean, turning the conversation a little different, there's been a lot of consolidation within the industry. And as we think about Jim's answer to the last question about every shop repairing every kind of car, and as you have this consolidation, does that create more or fewer problems for the integration of technology into the industry and dealing with different types of cars and different repairability, if you will?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, interestingly enough, as a consolidator, we have multiple learning, practices, I mean, we have a collision and then we integrate, all kinds of different learning and even web learning into that, and for our stores relative to what Jim was just talking about, and how we manage that and help them understand that. We have a good partnership with ICAR, with many of the OEs, the paint manufacturers, relative to operational controls and practices. And so we just, we continue to try and evolve and build all this in, right, and educate them relative to that. It's interesting. I just came from a performance group meeting with a whole bunch of stores in our system. And, there's a lot of talk around EV control relative to petrol, and what that's going to look like in the future. It was interesting. I was in a room with a whole bunch of them, and someone asked a question, and I said, I feel like this is like a DRP moment in the year 2000. And they said, how so? And I said, well, I remember where I was sitting when I was talking to somebody, and I was really struggling with all that. And he said, Dean, I would just make sure I took everything, And it was the best advice I ever got, and relative to managing that, because you never know where you're going to be, who's going to buy who's going to merge, and what that's going to look like in the future. And I would tell everybody, it's tough to be a generalist, but you better be one right now, and you better understand the landscape really hard before you make a decision that you're going to go one way or the other way. Because frankly, the government controls are going to drive some of the things, whether we think, I always laugh, okay, well, there are going to be 140 EV stations outside my hotel at night when I pull in, I want to charge, and you talk to some of the rental companies and they've got EV cars and nobody wants to take them because they've got anxiety, right, on where they're going to charge the thing up at, right? So unless they know they're on a real short-term moment, it's really tough to take one of those cars. So, but do I believe that EV will be the future? Absolutely, especially the hybrid. And I think the hybrids will become more complex and more mature in their modeling relative, and more manufacturers will look at that model relative to giving the customer that a bridge to pure EV, where they can plug in hybrid, and that's when I say hybrid, plug in hybrid, PEV, and where they can charge that, drive around on electric for a while, and then the gas engine can take over, and or they can charge while they're driving a little bit, or whatever that looks like. I think that'll be more and more strong. And so we'll have to manage that, and have to manage that technology in the vehicle and what that looks like. And by the way, that vehicle is just as dangerous to work on as an EV is, right? And I think Tim would give me a head shake on that one, but that is really dangerous. And so we've got to just understand what that's going to look like as we go forward. But, as a consolidator, I don't think that it's, and I know there's independents on here. I would just say that, managing their independent process, on a minuscule scale is just as important to them as it is to a consolidator. But there are economies of scale when you're doing it that way, and how you're managing it. And so, we look for those economies of scale relative to how we build on and how we model that for stores. Hope that was an answer to your question, Paul.
Great, thank you. Jim, bring it back to you then. As we conclude here with our formal questions, what do you see as the most pressing issues today, and what can we do as an industry to solve them? And that's a big, loaded question, kind of a way to wrap up a lot of the things we've talked about.
Sure. And I got a couple what I would call key points in that, Paul. And to me, it starts with, and I kind of alluded to it a little bit earlier, what we do with our CIC committee. I really believe it begins with a better alignment between repairers, insurers, OEs, and information providers. Everybody's out there creating their products, doing their thing, working in their segment of the industry. But how does it all ever come together, and how do we get each sector of the industry to understand the challenges and problems and issues with the other sector? Because many times that's not the case. At the end of the day, all of our businesses in collision repair are driven by a customer, whether it be a commercial fleet or an individual consumer who owns a vehicle. That's who we serve, right? It's a customer, and that customer must be made whole. There's insurance policy conditions that have to be met. There's the needs of the collision repair that have to be met in the whole process. The people who supply our industry with equipment and products and things, invaluable to what we do. We wouldn't be positioned to do that ourselves as collision repairs, but a lot of times we're not in alignment with each other in all those various segments. And because of that, there's definitely some misalignment that causes issues. And sometimes the consumer is the one that has the issue. We were debating this the other day on the total loss issue in the industry. When a car is deemed a total loss, but that person absolutely loves their car, the shop thinks they could fix it because there's not significant structural damage to total it or things that couldn't be fixed. And now the consumer is not happy with the shop or the insurer because the shop, says they can fix it, but the insurance company won't let them because they want to see it totaled and they don't want that car to be fixed. And now you've got that customer who's maybe had numerous repairs over the years done at your shop, disappointed that they can't have their baby fixed, and they don't want another car. They want that one back fixed. So these are all things that, if we could find ways of getting closer aligned within the industry with all the different sectors, I think that could really benefit everybody, including our mutual customer, which is the person, the vehicle owner. I think training is out there and it's really important. But there's a bunch of interesting dynamics, and Dean, I know you have to deal with this all the time. If you've got 5 OE manufacturers that all have training, and you are gold class certified, which you want to be, right? And you've got to keep taking training to keep that up, and then take the training every year from your manufacturers. There's a cost there, there's time. And in the world of time is money, the amount of training that shops have to do today it's through the roof. I mean, it's an incredible amount of their budget right now. All the costs of either traveling there or paying for the training, the time away from the job. When you have your hands on the car, you're making money for the business. When you're in training, you're getting smarter, and you will do better at repairing the car as a technician, right? Or a manager or a repair planner. But there just needs to be, I think, just general more consideration for what it takes to do collision repair these days. It's becoming almost what it takes to be a surgeon, if you ask me. It's an 8-year process to get to be a master technician, and that's equivalent to what, in the medical profession they have to go through to do what they have to do. I think the time has come, that collision shops, and I think the consolidators really push this in many different ways. And the groups like CarStar and any organization that's got enough critical mass and enough energy to help push the industry forward. I think that's something that independent shops have to really look at is the needle is moving forward. It's just not going real fast. There's still a long way to go. I always make the analogy when I have repairs done on my boat, and I had gotten an email this morning with boating season coming up in Wisconsin. Oh, Jim, while your boat was in storage, we noticed these things that are going to have to be taken care of. And, the rate that they charge is $150 an hour to work on my boat. my boat does not have the complexity that a 2021 automobile has, and does not require the knowledge and training and skill level that our technicians have to have. And I'm not making a push for labor rates, but I saw there was a press release this morning about, one of the major consolidators, has been working to increase their rates and things like that. And, it's talked about, and it's in our industry, and we can't go there today, or in any public meeting like this. But I'm just making the point that I think the economics of our industry, I think a lot of the really big players that in our industry, typically the consolidators, are really bringing to the forefront that as a financial model, it's not always really attractive to be in collision right now, just because a lot of factors and the complexity of the vehicles and all sorts of other pressures that shop owners face. So I think finding ways to push the needle on getting our industry everything that they're going to need to be maybe a little less stressful on a day-to-day basis, and understand just how valuable our services are. I heard a good story the other day from somebody who said, doctors, public service workers, the people who plow our streets, if they don't have a car to get to work, they can't do all the critical services that our nation needs. And it's true. If they have an accident, they've got to find a way to get to work. And transportation is really critical. And so what we do is really important. And I think it's starting to come of age slowly but surely. That's my story.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, we're only got a couple minutes left here, so I want to have time for questions. Stacy Phillips is our marketing director at CIECA, and Stacy's been monitoring questions. Stacy, do we have any questions?
We do. We have time for a couple of quick questions. By and large, OEM repair information is available either for a cost or required training. The challenge is in many cases the volume of that information. What do you suggest to create an environment to review, comprehend, and then follow those instructions, with them being reviewed by multiple employees every time? I don't know if maybe Dean, you want to start taking this a couple minutes, and Jim, if you have something to add, and if not, I'll ask a second question.
That's a great question, and we've actually addressed this on one of the OE boards that I sit on. And I asked them one time, I said, do engineers write this stuff, or do you have somebody in collision that's helping to write this stuff? And it was a really interesting conversation. That OE now has collision people that they have brought on to help write that information. So I understand the complexity of the information and the interpretation of it. And I think most OEs understand that we have to simplify that bullet point format and get to the point and tell us what we have to do and how it needs to be done. So that is a great question, by the way, because I understand the complexity of somebody trying to digest all that. And that's why, by the way, earlier I mentioned, well, you may have to have a diagnostic expert that's pulling all this data and making sure that they can walk out on the floor and help a guy understand it and execute against it, because there's so much information there being disseminated to them. So great question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dean. Jim, is there anything you wanted to add, or there's another question too that I can ask?
Oh, just briefly, I think that there are some solutions that it seems are emerging that will help solve some of that, some technology solutions, as well as I think the manufacturers through, like what Dean mentioned, advisory boards and things like that, realizing that delivering that information has to come in an easier format.
Perfect. Thank you both for your input. One other quick question, Jim. What ways can a shop communicate to consumers their qualifications to fix a car correctly, such as OEM shop certification, technician training, procedures followed, ADAS calibration, etc.? Well,
that question coming from you, Stacy, is so appropriate, because I would say it's all about marketing. You got to tell the world, and I know that's your specialty. But I don't think our industry does a good enough job talking about how important a calibration is, right? Just a simple calibration of bumper sensors and how that could impact, an improper calibration could impact. And, you know, putting out a video, putting out consumer messages on educating the consumer. I know that's 3M's model. You know, if we teach them, they'll buy from us, right? And I think the collision industry needs to do that as well. We can talk all we want about shops should do safe and proper repairs, but if the shops that do them tell consumers why their repair is significantly more safer than somebody who doesn't calibrate and scan and use OE procedures and all of those things that we know we have to do and the good shops are doing, I think that's the best way to tell the world, is not to tell them, you know, how wonderful the experience will be. That's important too, but to let them know that there's some safety issues that they also got to consider, because most people, including some people that you would think would know, and I've had this conversation with strangers, they don't realize how calibration can impact the safety of their car, and they don't know what calibration is. So all sorts of ways that I think we could inform consumers about some of the safety items that as an industry, I don't think we are good enough at this point yet to do that, to look for the right shop that does the right thing.
Thank you, Jim. And Dean, was there anything you'd like to add to that? And then we'll wrap up our CIECAST.
Yeah, I just think your web and your digital presence is really important to you. You know, we work as a consolidator to get permission to use certain logos and things by manufacturers related to certification, and then we monitor those certifications in our stores, and then try and attach that to their microsites and things like that. And we work on that pretty diligently. I just think there's a constant process that you know, that the store has to keep themselves in front of the customer digitally. But it's so important for consumer advocacy groups, you know, like Yahoo and Google and all that. I mean, you've got to have good ratings out there relative, because there's a set of people about millennium and under that are basically going to look at that and judge a store by that process, regardless of what you're saying to them. So I think we have to make sure that we're giving customers good experiences and that those are being promoted for you by others in that digital space.
Thank you. Thank you both.
Thank you, Stacy. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Dean. Appreciate your time. We're about out of time, so just wrap up here real quickly. This presentation has been recorded and will be available on CIECA.com. We'll also be hosting our Connects 2022 conference in September, or I'm sorry, in St. Louis in September of this year. So visit CIECA.com to learn more and follow us on social media. And with that, we conclude today's webinar. Thank you all very much.